Okay, so you're with us today, and we are going like deep up into a topic that's, incredibly important, and that's the whole experience of African and Caribbean children growing up in the UK.
Yeah.
And we found this, this really fascinating resource from Sharper Minds Academy
Hmm.
that kind of lays out, some of the big challenges, but then even more importantly, goes into these really strategic ideas for how to like actually make things better.
Yeah. It's a really thoughtful piece, and it goes, pretty deep into a lot of the issues.
Right.
And I think our aim here should be to, try to cut through all that and distill it down
Yeah.
into like the most essential takeaways for our listeners so they can walk away
Right.
with, like a really clear and concise picture of, what these young people are up against and what can be done to support them.
Okay, so we want to make sure, our listeners are walking away with, feeling like they've learned something, that they've learned it well,
Absolutely.
and they've learned it efficiently.
Quickly and thoroughly.
Quickly and thoroughly. Okay.
Yeah.
So the article is called Empowering African and Caribbean Children in the UK: Challenges and Strategic Solutions.
Hmm.
And I think, one of the things that really jumped out at me reading this was this concept of like a cultural identity crisis.
Yeah.
Can you unpack that a little bit? Like, what's going on there?
Well, it's really interesting because, uh, so many of these young people, they're experiencing this kind of, this tension.
Yeah.
They're caught between their own, very rich cultural heritage on the one hand,
Right.
and then like the dominant British culture on the other.
Yeah.
And so, it's this feeling of like not really belonging to either one fully.
Right.
And the article really suggests that, this can go even deeper than just, a feeling.
Right.
It can actually lead to, issues of low self-esteem,
Mm-hmm.
lack of pride in their own cultural background.
Yeah.
And, that foundation of knowing and valuing where you come from.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's so important.
It is.
For anyone's sense of self.
Totally. And that kind of leads right into the next challenge that the article talks about. And, unfortunately, this is not news to anyone,
Mm-hmm.
but that is the ongoing reality of racism and discrimination.
Yeah.
But the article kind of frames it in terms of, the specific impact that it has on these children.
Right.
So what does it say about that?
Well, for many of these kids, racial bias and those microaggressions that we hear so much about,
Right.
they're still like a daily occurrence,
Yeah.
these kind of subtle and often unintentional, expressions of prejudice.
Yeah.
They can really wear a person down.
Yeah.
In Sharper Minds Academy, they actually highlight some of the tangible effects of this.
Mm-hmm.
They talk about how it impacts, mental health,
Oh,
how it
right.
affects how these young people see themselves, their self-worth,
Yeah.
and even their academic journey.
Oh, wow.
It's just this constant headwind that they're facing.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like this constant pressure that you're talking about.
Yeah.
It must just be exhausting.
Yeah.
And that leads us to, kind of the next point, which is educational disparities.
Mm.
So it's not just about, individual experiences.
Right.
The article seems to suggest that there's something, broader going on here within the education system itself.
Yeah.
So what do they point to there?
Well, the article actually points to, disproportionately high rate of school exclusions
Mm-hmm.
among, African and Caribbean kids.
Oh, wow.
And they also mention, the lower academic performance on average.
Right.
And I think what's really fascinating is they connect this back to potential systemic biases,
Right.
within the education system itself.
Yeah.
And they also talk about the lack of, culturally relevant teaching approaches
Yeah.
that might actually resonate with, the diverse backgrounds of these students.
Right.
And makes you wonder, is the learning environment really set up for their success?
Right. Are we doing enough
Yeah.
to support them?
Exactly.
And that kind of brings up, this other point, which is, lack of representation. This is specifically talking about the national curriculum.
Mm.
And so, it's about, what stories are being told,
Yeah.
whose contributions are being acknowledged.
Right.
What does the article have to say about that?
Well, the article argues that when the history and the culture and the achievements of Black people are largely absent from the curriculum,
Right.
it sends a very powerful message,
Yeah. Yeah.
And that message is one of, invisibility,
Right.
marginalization.
Yeah.
Like your story doesn't matter,
Yeah.
and if you don't see yourself reflected in what you're learning,
Mm-hmm.
it can be incredibly disempowering.
Right.
And it can make you feel like, your history and your background just don't matter.
It's just like you're being erased.
Yeah.
It's so interesting. Okay, so then the article shifts to something that, obviously affects, many communities. But that's the very real impact of socioeconomic inequality.
Mm.
So how does the article kind of talk about how that intersects with the experiences of, African and Caribbean children in the UK?
Well, the article reminds us that, a significant number of families in these communities, they face real hardship.
Yeah.
We're talking about poverty, we're talking about unstable housing,
Yeah.
limited access to, essential resources.
Right.
And what's really crucial to understand is that, these factors, they create very real barriers
Yeah.
to, a child's opportunities and their overall well-being.
Mm-hmm.
It's really hard to prioritize things like education or mental well-being
Right.
when your basic needs aren't being met consistently.
There's those fundamental building blocks, aren't there?
Exactly.
Okay, so that leads us to another challenge that the article brings up, and this is the the mental health stigma that unfortunately exists in many communities. And this is a tough one. Like how do we even begin to overcome that?
Well, the article really emphasizes how this stigma
Mm-hmm.
prevents children from, actually reaching out for the help they need.
Right.
And so they end up suffering in silence,
Right.
reluctant to seek help.
Yeah.
And this can have, really significant and long-lasting consequences
Of course.
on their emotional well-being.
It's so important to have those open conversations.
Yeah.
And to provide accessible support.
Absolutely.
Okay, so the last challenge that the article addresses is, this really concerning issue of gang influence and violence.
Mm.
And I thought it was really interesting how the article kind of shed light on, why some young people might become vulnerable to this. So
Yeah.
what did they have to say about that?
Well, I think in the context of all the challenges we've already talked about,
Mhm.
things like the lack of positive role models,
Right.
the socioeconomic pressures. The article suggests that for some young people, gang culture can actually seem to offer this false sense of, identity and belonging.
Right.
It's like, they're not finding it anywhere else.
Yeah.
So they're drawn to that.
Right.
And so, it's not presented as, this inherent desire,
Right.
but rather as a response to this,
Yeah.
lack of positive alternatives.
Right. So this complex interplay of factors
Exactly.
that kind of leads to this vulnerability.
Yeah.
Okay, so that was a lot. We just went through, this whole list of challenges.
It's a pretty sobering picture.
It is, but I think, what's really great about the article is that it doesn't just stop there.
Yeah, that's what's so valuable about this piece.
Right.
It doesn't just identify the problems.
Right.
It actually pivots to, offering some solutions,
Right.
some really strategic solutions.
Yeah. And they're aimed at actually empowering these young people. And I think, what was really cool is how the solutions actually map onto the challenges that we just talked about.
Yeah.
So it's this really coherent approach.
Yeah, it's very well structured.
Yeah. So let's go back to, the beginning and talk about the cultural identity crisis.
Mm-hmm.
How does the article suggest we address that?
Well, the big idea here is reconnecting
Okay.
with culture and identity.
Yeah.
And one really concrete suggestion they have is these heritage workshops.
Oh, interesting.
So these would be community-led sessions.
Yeah.
Where, young people could really delve into, African and Caribbean history, traditions, languages.
Okay.
Just imagine the richness and the sense of connection they could foster.
Yeah, it's building that foundation of cultural pride that you were talking about. So that's one thing. What else?
Okay, so another really interesting idea is these cultural exchange programs.
Oh, wow.
So, they talk about creating partnerships with schools
Mm-hmm.
in Africa and the Caribbean.
Okay.
So, you could have things like pen pal projects,
Oh, cool.
virtual tours,
Oh, wow.
and even potentially, student exchanges.
So it's taking it outside the classroom.
Yeah.
Making it a real experience.
A lived experience, exactly.
That's so cool. Okay, so the third thing.
The third element here is, expanding participation in festivals and celebrations
Right.
that, showcase these cultures.
Okay.
So really bringing these vibrant experiences to the forefront
Hmm.
and allowing, young people to really participate
Mm-hmm.
and to feel that sense of pride
Right.
and community belonging.
Okay, so that's all about, that first challenge.
Mm.
Okay, let's move on to racism and discrimination.
Okay.
This is a big one. So what kind of educational strategies does the article suggest?
Well, the focus here is really on combating racism through education
Okay.
at its core, and a key recommendation they have is anti-racism training. And they actually advocate for this to be compulsory for all educators
Okay.
because, equipping teachers with the understanding and the tools
Yeah.
to address bias is just so fundamental.
Right. They're the ones on the front lines.
Exactly.
Okay.
So
yeah.
Another major point is the need for a truly inclusive curriculum.
Okay.
So this goes beyond, just mentioning Black history during Black History Month.
Right.
This is about really integrating African and Caribbean history and culture and achievements
Mm-hmm.
across all subject areas,
Right.
making it, a natural and integral part of the educational narrative.
So it's not just like this one-off thing.
Yeah.
It's like woven into the fabric.
Woven into the fabric, yeah.
Okay, so we've got the anti-racism training.
Mhm.
We've got the inclusive curriculum. Is there anything else?
Yes, actually, they also talk about the role of students themselves.
Okay.
So they propose the development of peer educator programs.
Oh, cool.
And these would be like, student-led initiatives where, they're actually promoting these open and honest conversations
Mhm.
about diversity and inclusion and discrimination
Right.
among their peers.
So it's like peer-to-peer.
Yeah,
It's really powerful.
absolutely.
Okay, let's move on to educational disparities.
Mhm.
So how can we raise academic achievement? What are some of the practical steps that the article suggests?
Well, their strategies here are pretty targeted.
Okay.
Firstly, they talk about, tutoring and homework clubs
Mm-hmm.
that are really tailored to the needs
Right.
of, students who are underperforming,
Okay.
just providing that extra support.
So it's like that personalized attention.
Exactly.
Okay, what else?
They also emphasize, mentorship programs.
Oh, that's a good one.
Yeah, so connecting students with professionals
Mm-hmm.
who come from similar backgrounds
Right.
and, who can serve as positive role models,
Mm-hmm.
offer guidance support, and just, a vision of what's possible.
Yeah, because sometimes it's so powerful to see someone who's kind of walked a similar path
Absolutely.
and has achieved success.
Hmm.
Okay, so that's mentorship. What about the role of families,
Right.
in all of this?
Well, they actually stress the importance of parental engagement.
Okay.
So providing parents with the resources and the support,
Mm-hmm.
they need to actively participate
Right.
and support their children's education.
So it's like a partnership.
It's a homeschool partnership, yeah.
Right. It's not just, the school's responsibility. It's
Right.
everybody working together.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about supporting mental health and well-being.
Okay.
Especially given the stigma that we talked about before.
Right.
What are some solutions there?
Well, they really focus on, creating this more supportive and understanding environment.
Okay.
And one key suggestion is to ensure access to culturally aware counseling services.
Oh, that's interesting.
So this means, having therapists
Yeah.
who really understand the specific cultural context
Right.
and experiences
Yep.
of the community they're serving.
Yeah. That sensitivity, I think, is so important
Yeah, it's
for
crucial.
building trust.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that's counseling. What else?
They also recommend, proactive awareness campaigns
Okay.
that are really aimed at destigmatizing mental health.
Mm-hmm.
And so, having these open and honest conversations within schools,
Right.
within the wider community,
Yeah.
just normalizing these discussions
Yeah.
as a first step toward, actually seeking help.
Right, because if you're afraid to even talk about it,
Yeah,
you're never going to get the help.
exactly.
Okay. And is there a role for peer support here as well?
Or absolutely.
Yeah.
They talk about creating peer support groups, and these would provide, safe spaces
Right.
where young people can connect with each other,
Yeah.
share their experiences,
Yeah.
and, build this sense of community and understanding.
Right. So it's that shared experience
Yeah.
that can be so powerful.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's move on to economic inequity.
Okay.
This is a big one.
Yeah.
What kind of solutions do they propose for this?
Well, their approach here is multifaceted.
Okay.
One key suggestion is to establish these community resource hubs.
Interesting.
So these would be like central locations
Mhm.
offering a range of essential services.
Okay.
Things like job training,
Mhm.
housing advice, financial literacy education for families.
Right. So it's like a one-stop shop for
Exactly.
all these different needs.
Yeah.
Okay. What else?
They also talk about, scholarships and grants,
Okay.
both in terms of promoting existing opportunities,
Mm-hmm.
but also advocating for, more targeted financial support
Right.
for students from these communities.
So it's like removing those financial barriers
Yes.
to opportunity.
hmm Yeah.
Okay. And then the last piece in this area.
Well, they also highlight these youth empowerment initiatives.
Okay.
So, partnering with programs that focus on, developing leadership skills, fostering an entrepreneurial mindset,
Mm-hmm.
just, overall skills development for young people,
So investing in their future.
investing in their future. Yeah.
Okay. So let's talk about gang involvement.
Mm-hmm.
This is, a tough one. So how do we prevent it?
Well, the emphasis here is really on providing positive influences
Okay.
and strengthening community bonds.
Right.
And one key strategy is to really actively highlight positive role models
Okay.
within the community itself.
Mm-hmm.
So showcasing successful individuals
Right.
from diverse fields,
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
really inspire young people.
Right. And show them that there are other paths.
Exactly.
Okay. What else?
Well, they also stress the importance of enriching after-school activities.
Oh, that's a good one.
Yeah, so offering, a wider array of, engaging extracurricular programs,
Right.
in areas like sports, STEM, arts, culture.
Right. So giving them those outlets.
Yeah, giving them those outlets and keeping them engaged
Right.
in positive pursuits.
Okay. And are there like specific skills that can kind of help young people navigate these situations?
Yeah, they recommend teaching conflict resolution skills.
Okay.
Things like emotional regulation,
Right.
peaceful methods of resolving disputes.
So that they don't resort to violence,
Directly.
as a way to solve their problems.
Yeah.
Okay. So those are the solutions, but how do we know that we're actually, making a difference?
Right.
How do we track our progress and, make sure we're on the right track?
Well, the final section of the article really emphasizes, the need for this data-driven approach.
Okay.
So systematically monitoring, academic, emotional, behavioral data
Okay.
to really understand the impact of, the interventions that are being put in place.
Right.
And to see what's working best.
All right. So it's all about like using that data to guide us
Exactly.
and to make those adjustments.
Mm-hmm.
Because the data is important. What else?
Well, they also talk about the vital role of community feedback.
Uh,
So creating these, genuine and open channels
yeah.
for parents, teachers,
Yes.
students
Yeah.
to really share, their experiences, their insights, their recommendations.
So their voices are being heard.
Their voices need to be heard.
Yeah.
And then the final point.
And that's the principle of continuous improvement.
Right.
So, using the data and the feedback
Yeah.
to constantly refine these strategies
Yeah.
and make sure they're really relevant and effective
Hmm.
and addressing the evolving needs of the community.
It's this constant cycle
Yeah.
of learning and adapting.
Exactly.
Okay, so it sounds like the Sharper Minds Academy has really put together this, comprehensive framework,
Yeah, I mean, they really have.
and it's well thought out, and it addresses all these different aspects.
Yeah, and the core message, it really emphasizes the power of this culturally sensitive and community-led approach.
Right.
So, it's about working collaboratively from within
Yeah.
to empower these young people.
Rather than, imposing solutions from the outside.
Right, and they really stress that it's a collective responsibility.
Mhm.
It's not just, one group or one institution's job to
Yeah.
do this. It's like everybody, families, schools,
Yeah.
community leaders,
Mm-hmm.
the wider society
Absolutely.
all have a role to play.
Yeah.
Okay, and so I think, one thing that was really encouraging is they actually suggest that many of these interventions are low cost,
Mm.
but high impact,
Yeah.
so we can actually make meaningful progress.
Yeah. I think that's really hopeful.
It is.
Shows that, change is possible
Yeah.
with focused effort and the right strategies in place.
Yeah, I think so too. Okay, so for you listening, we really hope that this deep dive has given you that clear and comprehensive understanding that we promised.
Yeah.
We've explored all those core challenges,
Yeah.
and we've talked about these really thoughtful and practical solutions,
Yeah.
that the Sharper Minds Academy has put forward.
Mm.
And I think, to leave you with something to think about, considering all of this,
Mhm.
what do you think is the single most important thing that we can do?
Yeah. If you could just choose one thing
Mm-hmm.
to really create that positive change,
Yeah.
what would it be?
Yeah. What would have the biggest impact?
What would have the biggest ripple effect,
Yeah.
for these young people?
Yeah, we'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for joining.